Boeing suspended production out of the Puget Sound area, I want to say about 2 weeks ago. Well, they have just announced within the last few minutes that beginning next week, they will be bringing back production in the commercial airplane division out there. And that basically you're talking about Everett, which is where they build the 787 Dreamliner, the 767, the 777. They're going to be bringing that production back in a phased approach starting next week. So really what you're looking at here from Boeing is 2 weeks where they were essentially down with no production, but they're going to start bringing it back next week, obviously working with the local authorities in terms of making sure that all of the production systems can operate safely as they all try to deal with COVID-19. But obviously, Brian, this is important and welcome news for Boeing investors that they will be resuming production out in the Puget Sound area starting next week.
Wow, yet another piece, sort of, Phil, of good-ish news in a sense from a macroeconomic perspective. Boeing obviously sees something, whether it's in health or safety or demand, that says, let's get people back to work. Phil LeBeau, breaking news there on Boeing. Karen Finerman, Guy, okay, we're going to go back to Guy. Guy, you're going to get a lot of time tonight, I have a suspicion here, because the cannon string between us and Karen was cut, I think. Let's talk about the macro markets. Three things have happened in the last 15 minutes that, from a macro perspective, bear weight. The president launched this sort of guidelines for the states, which, seems fairly reasonable on its face. The Gilead news, and now Boeing, at least in Washington, if not in South Carolina, is going back to work. We're starting to see Germany is sort of mini reopening on Monday. There are starting to be some macro green shoots out there. And maybe I'm desperate for good news, Guy, and I apologize if I am.
No, I don't think you're desperate. I mean, look, yes, we're all desperate for good news, but I don't think you're reaching here. I mean, the Gilead story is very encouraging, without question. I missed the president's remarks. I'm sorry, getting prepped for the show, but from what you say, they were pretty thoughtful, and it's seemingly something that can be rolled out. That's encouraging. And obviously Boeing, which was a huge drag today on the Dow, despite the fact that the Dow closed unchanged, it's probably going to get back half the losses we saw today. Everything on the margins is very encouraging. Throw on top of that the fact that the stock market is recovered in a very meaningful way. We're here at 2,800 or thereabouts in the S&P 500, the 50% retracement of the all-time high we recently saw, and that low we saw on the 23rd of March, 2193. That's very encouraging. I think, the Tim Seymour camp that, that test of those March 23rd lows might not be in the cards is looking more and more reasonable. I will say, despite everything we just talked about, I'm hard-pressed to have it, a situation where we don't have some meaningful move to the downside. Now, that might not be 15%, but I could see it anywhere from 6 to 8%. But given the backdrop that you just talked about and the fact that the VIX continues to sort of melt away is absolutely very encouraging here, Brian. Yes.
Yeah, and for the people that don't know, maybe I jumped the gun, Steve Grasso, the president, some headlines crossing, 6 p.m. press conference tonight, so in about 50 minutes time, and he sort of gave guidelines to the states, like gyms can reopen in some places, bars cannot. That's what I'm referring to. We got to wait for more details at 6 o'clock. You had that, you had Gilead, you had the Boeing news, sort of all factored together. And we can talk about the specific airlines also in a second, because that was on the opposite side of the spectrum, Steve. I've got to imagine that there are some, again, green shoots out there, and maybe we're grasping at those green shoots, but I guess who can blame us?
Of course, and I agree with you. There are green shoots, and I do think I'm still sticking to my guns that this market is going to be impossible to play from the short side for the next 30 or 45 days or so, because you have people trying to get back to work. You have economies that are starting. So it's a fool's errand to jump in front of that trade. Now, with that Gilead news, we don't know where that's going to lead, Brian. Having said that, if that gains any type of steam and momentum, you can't get in front of a vaccine. A vaccine is the holy grail for this entire market. It doesn't matter what sector, what space, everything will rally. Now, when is your time to sell the market? When we get back to work, when the economies start up again. Because if we see that it doesn't happen in a smooth fashion and hospitalizations start to tick higher, ventilators start to tick higher, deaths start to tick higher, then we will retest the lows. But until then, you have to kind of get out of the way of the market and just buy it, or just hold on to your longs at this point.
Yeah, and I don't want to Tim Seymour. I'm not trying to, listen, I'm obviously, to quote everybody on every network for the last month, I'm not a virologist, but we have all studied a lot about these 1918 pandemics. We had a run, it went away, then it came back worse than ever in some places. There is always the risk, certainly, of that happening. And not to be sort of negative on it, but you look at the action in the individual airline stocks today, Tim, I got to imagine that had to trouble you a bit, particularly because they're getting billions in taxpayer money and the stock market doesn't seem to care.
Well, yeah, I mean, the airlines have a unique dynamic, and if you look at capacity cuts and the revenue numbers, we're talking about 85 to 90%, and we're not talking about necessarily, we got numbers out of semiconductors, Taiwan Semi today, where they talked about down high single digits. It's totally different. And obviously, in terms of the revenue, it's lost revenue. So the balance sheets are eroding by the minute, not the day, not the week. We know how much cash that Delta Airlines is burning. But it still does come back to the duration here. The problem is the comments that are more about, hey, we can open up certain parts, but there are other parts that include group gatherings, but obviously a lot of long distance travel, or the implication of such that investors, but consumers won't be interested in going down that road. Yeah, but again, the news yesterday on airlines was enough to see these things trade up 4 or 5% in the after hours on their balance sheets, on the impact of the government loans. I would tend at these levels to assume we've priced in 85 to 90% downside. Go for the best balance sheets. Delta Airlines is that one.
Yeah, Karen, listen, I think it was a Cowen report out this morning, and I was a little bit critical of it on social media. They said that normal travel, what they consider normal, will not resume for 3 to 5 years. If you believe that number, then it would seem that just logic would say the airlines, no matter how much federal backstop they get, are uninvestable. I mean, they can't go on with this level of 97% empty planes for that much longer.
Right, although maybe there's a lot of middle ground. I don't know what back to normal means. I mean, they were operating, obviously, in the last couple years. It was really boom time for them, and they were just able to add on more and more revenue. Who knows what the configuration of a plane will look like? Who knows if there'll be a middle seat. So I don't know that structurally they could get back to that. But there is some middle ground between where we are now, which is just about zero, and some level, but I think utilization needs to be way, way higher. It has to be well over 50%, probably north of 75% for them to make money. So I don't own the space. I really do hope they survive, but there are parts of this market that are just really not trading well. I don't know if you spoke at the top of the show, sorry for the technical difficulties, about banks, but airlines, banks, small caps, some parts of this market are not seeing this V-shaped recovery.